This is Legislature's The Inside Story, and I'm your host, Tim Story, the CEO of the National Conference of State Legislatures. Thank you for being here. Today on the podcast, my guest is Amy Walter, editor and publisher of Cook Political Report. She took on that role last year after years covering Congress and elections for Cook and many other outlets like the National Journal, ABC News, and the PBS NewsHour, where she's a regular commentator. She has a long view on issues, candidates, races, and how policy gets made in Washington and in the states. We'll be talking about all that today. Amy Walter, I have been so looking forward to spending time with you today ever since we figured out we'd be getting together here and recording this podcast. So I am very, very grateful for you for making time. Thank you.
Oh, this is so fun. We could talk for 7 hours.
Well, you're an extremely busy person. You got a lot of gigs. I get the sense like every time I turn around, you got something new going on. And of course, the biggest one is, and we should really start there because it wasn't so long ago that the venerable, do I have to say the word venerable ahead of Cook Political Report? Is that required?
You do. It's actually written to my contracts. Yeah.
That the venerable Cook Political Report is now the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and you're the publisher and editor-in-chief. So congratulations. When did that happen? It wasn't so long ago.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago. It was over the summer, so it was back in early August. Obviously, I've been with the Cook Political Report for quite some time. I started way back in 1998, was there covering the House through 2006, early 2007, and then I went out and served as the editor-in-chief at the Hotline, and then went over to ABC News as political director. And then, as I like to tell everyone, like the prodigal daughter, I had to come home again. And I came back to the Cook Political Report after the 2012 presidential election, and have been there ever since, doing much more of a national focus. And, Charlie started the Cook Political Report in the 80s. So we are over 30 years old. It's quite a remarkable run. He created a model and a brand that a lot of people have tried to copy or emulate, but it is just such a rarity even now to have folks who we want to cover races. We're nonpartisan. We don't take positions on policy. We don't get into advertising. We just like to, as Charlie has long said, we don't pick sides. We just don't want to be wrong.
Oh my gosh, I'm going to steal that. We don't pick sides. We just don't want to be wrong. I think you partly just described NCSL, by the way. So we share this affinity. I think we also both share, speak for you at somewhat, a pretty deep affection for Charlie Cook. He is a special guy, and I don't know if he listens to podcasts. I know this is probably his number one on his playlist, but if he did, I would hope he would hear that because boy, I sure do love that guy. And he has established something that is venerable, but is also kind of an institution in its own way. Thanks for that perfect background, because you are somebody I think that is tremendously respected. I know you know that, but I'll add my voice to that. I think mainly because you've managed to hang. It is not easy, as we know at NCSL, to navigate the hyper-partisanship of the world that we live in, and it's something that's changed. And so you've been very successful at that, and that's why your voice has so much credibility and your perspective is so important.
Thank you. Well, it is. You're right. It has gotten to be, just covering politics feels so different. And you know this too, even from when I began. I talk to a lot of young people who come to Washington and they say, right, how can I do what you do? Or how can I get involved in journalism and in covering politics? And I go back to, gosh, I don't know if I have the right answer for you, because when I started, the answer to that question was pretty simple. Get out of Washington, go to your local paper or a local paper, right? You want to understand politics, go to the Cleveland Plain Dealer, go to the Denver Post, go where you're going to learn it from the ground up. That is better training than anything you can do in Washington. And the goal would be you work your way up. One day, maybe you become the political editor or the correspondent for a paper. You come to Washington as that paper's correspondent for politics for Washington. When I started, there would be, you go to these press conferences on Capitol Hill, and you'd have 40, 50 local reporters, right? Hey, my name's blah, blah, blah. I'm with the Connecticut Post. I'm here with the Sacramento Bee. None of those folks are around anymore. And all politics now has become nationalized. The rooms are still packed with reporters, but they're all covering process more than they're covering policy. It means that every single outlet there is asking, what do we think this means for the race for speaker? What does this mean about the strategy for the midterms or the shakeup in leadership? The conversation would be a lot more focused on, okay, I cover the Northeast or whatever. I want to understand in this bill, what is that going to mean for people who live in my region? Not to jump too far ahead, but I do think that's been part of the challenge for Democrats this year when we look at how much attention the media put on the infighting, the intra-party warring with Democrats over legislative agenda, Build Back Better, or voting rights, or the filibuster. And so what regular people out in the world saw was just utter dysfunction, in part because that's really good fodder for the people who cover politics now. And so Democrats sort of wring their hands saying, I don't understand. We passed all this great stuff earlier in the year, right? We got infrastructure done and we got this rescue plan that put trillions of dollars out in stimulus checks. And no one's talking about that, in part because you now spent August, September, October, November, December in process land that got augmented by the fact that that is exactly what the national media loves to cover. That's right in their wheelhouse.
I've been thinking about this. What are the incentives, right? And I was thinking about this. There seems to be a little bubble of coverage around McConnell and his spat with Florida Senator Scott. The media will chase down AOC and Speaker Pelosi are crosswise and yada, yada, yada. And is it because they're trying to trend? I feel like that now everybody's goal is to trend on Twitter.
You are right that the incentive structure is so much of the problem. Whether it's the internal spats, right, who doesn't like who, or the people who are doing absolutely ridiculous things. It's performative. So on the Republican side, right, Madison Cawthorn and the Lauren Boebert and those folks who really are truly, in Cawthorn's case, have made pretty clear that their job in Washington is to just do communications. They're not particularly interested in the legislating part. So there is a tremendous amount of performance that gets rewarded. And it's not just that you trend on Twitter, you raise a ton of money because everybody gets to see this. Help me take on the fill in the blank bogey person. And if you are cable news and you're desperate for something that people will stay glued to, there's nothing better than personalities and people making ridiculous statements to keep people engaged. You're not going to keep people engaged with a really thoughtful conversation about unemployment insurance.
So why do we have to accept that? You just said that as a declarative statement. You are not going to keep people engaged talking about unemployment insurance. And I'm going to say, well, maybe that's what we have to figure out. Maybe we have to figure out how to make boring policy a little more interesting because it matters so much more than the antics of players on both sides. We got to be really clear. This is it's not a one-side thing, right? So yeah, I heard you say you're not going to get people interested in unemployment insurance. You're probably right, but I guess I don't want to give up.
You don't have to. And here's the great thing about the explosion of media, thanks in large part to what we're doing right now, which is communicating to each other over this machine called the internet, or whatever, over a machine using the internet. Part of the great thing about it is you have access now to so much more than was ever possible, and getting it in a first run way, right? I can actually watch a governor give a state of the state response. I don't have to wait for TV to cover it, right? They might think it's boring. I want to hear it directly from the governor. I can go and actually find it, click on it, watch it myself. I don't have to have it filtered through the media And there are a tremendous number of sites that do exactly what you're saying, which is I'm going to walk you through a pretty complicated policy, but do it in a way that is accessible to you. Vox Media was sort of built on that, right? Let's understand X. The New York Times has a number of podcasts like this too. Let's take a really complicated issue, bring people in who have opinions and expertise on it. They may be on opposite sides of it, but we're going to walk you through it, help you understand it. So it's available.
Well, I'll quickly plug something. There's an outfit called Starting Point that's actually Chris Evans, the actor who's in the Marvel movies. He's done this where they sort of pair two people. And one interesting thing is they don't have any comments on this page. And we're actually trying to pair with them. Like, we're going to talk about the issues in states. Abortion is a big issue, right, with the pending decision on Roe. So, they'll have people come in and very sort of drain some of the enormous passion out and talk about, okay, here are the issues. And so I think there are outlets like that are starting up. And maybe if enough flowers bloom, some of them will survive.
I do think it's great, but I have, I have a teenager. The hard thing is to and he loves doing this, right? Like, I want to go find, most teenagers do. I want to find stuff that contradicts what my parents tell me, or I want to find it myself, right? And so he'll come in and he'll just drop some phrase, or he'll say, did you know something? Where'd you get that? Right? So we spend a lot of time. It's always the internet. And sometimes he's found some really, really cool commentators, sites that are really thoughtful and are actually factual. He's found a lot that are, right, some guy on YouTube who has 10 million followers. Where did he get his information? It's getting harder and harder.
I mean, you talked about it there a second ago where, like, we're in this wonderful time where you can hear directly from the sources. It's also a curse, right? There's so much volume. We do have to talk about, your perspective on American political scene today. And again, a very thoughtful one, not the kind of knee-jerk who's angry at who this morning. But so obviously the midterm elections, which come around every 2 years in our system, they are on the horizon. Primaries have already, Texas has just held their primaries. What can you tell us about this fall's midterms?
All right. Well, first of all, I think we have a number of really interesting storylines. So if you want to talk about what I think is fun, and I know what you think is fun, right? Which is there's more than just what happens in November. There are the storylines that happen as we move through these primaries. And so the storyline that's going to get the most attention, of course, is how are these Trump-endorsed candidates doing? The most high profile is Georgia, where the former president still so angry with every statewide elected official in the state of Georgia campaigning against the sitting Republican governor, endorsing former Republican senator who lost in the 2020 election. He's cutting ads for him. He's going to do rallies for him, doing everything he can to raise money for Purdue. He needs to, right, in his words, right, just show Brian Kemp that the people of Georgia are so angry that you did not stand up for me and stand up for the people of Georgia and allowed Joe Biden to rig the election. But you know what? Brian Kemp's doing real well. Actually, he's raising a lot of money. He's still very well liked in the state. The latest polling has him ahead. And it's not the only state where he's weighed in, right? We've got other gubernatorial races, Senate races. So that's going to be one storyline. The other storyline that we're tracking, especially at the congressional level, is in these very red or very blue states where the primary is basically the general. What kind of candidates are coming through? Are these the kinds of candidates who they did appeal to the most extreme, or they were endorsed by the most extreme, or they, again, then we'll have the Trump endorsed versus not Trump endorsed. We'll also have Justice Democrats, right? The Bernie Sanders AOC wing, they've been getting engaged in some races. What is that makeup? What kinds of people do we know are definitely coming to Washington? Both their background, their style, what things are they focused on? I think that will be fascinating. We're also going to have to watch these, because it's a redistricting year, member versus member races, which are always uncomfortable for the party, right? And the caucus. I was somewhere the other day thinking, man, that just must be so weird to like walk into your caucus meeting knowing the person across the table from you're going to be running ads attacking them in a couple weeks. They're your colleague and your friend, but you're up against each other. So all of that is going to be really fascinating as we have the run up to the fall. Each and every election is unique, and it has something either unexpected or something we may never have seen before, right? I think just at the turn of the 21st century, we've had 9/11, we've had the financial crash, we've had a pandemic. We now have, this record high inflation. We're having a land war in Europe right now. I mean, these are all things that none of us in our lifetimes had ever seen before. So they're all unique. Each a different president was in place during each one of those events. And yet, there are these sort of constants in every one of these midterm elections, these sort of fundamentals that help us to make each one of these midterms, while they're unique, they all have the same thing in common. It's a referendum on the sitting president, referendum on the party that's in power. And when people are in a bad mood or when things aren't going well, they take it out on that president, they take it out on that party. Every single one of the last 4 midterm elections, you had a president, right, sitting somewhere in the 45% job approval rate. You had independents really overwhelmingly disappointed with the sitting president. In every one of those elections, you had one party that had total control of Washington. Well, except 2014, they didn't, but they had the Senate control. History, they say, doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And this feels very much like 06, 10, and 18, where you come into an election with total power, but the headwinds, the mood of the electorate is just so dismal.
I hear you, Amy, and I was thinking about that like how preposterous it is to try to speculate about what the mood will be in October of this year, November, and as well as will anything be resolved with the war in Ukraine, and that's on people. People are riveted to the. I mean, I am. I'm sort of obsessive about it, and I know a lot of people seem to be. Now, will that sustain itself? Probably not. But what will be driving it? So I feel like it feels like there's a lot of uncertainty to me. And then I know, and that for the last 30 midterms, back to 1900, the turn of the 20th century, the party in the White House loses seats in legislatures 28 out of 30 times. So that is just as consistent a trend as there is in all of political world, and it's very similar for the U.S. Congress.
There's a reason for that. It's not that's a random happenstance. And look, in the times when it hasn't happened, at least at the federal level, there were unique events. Would you say, oh yeah, well, 9/11
and the Great Depression? It was in legislatures. It's 22. In 2002, right? So it's
no, but it's happened, right? And then 98 was the one other. In those cases, at least in the 98 and 2002, you had a president who had a 60% approval rating or higher. It wasn't just that things were chaotic or uncertain, because again, we had never. If you had said to me, "Gosh, the president of the United States is going to be impeached, and yet he still will have a 60% approval rating," right? That seems like those two things can't possibly coexist. But the economy was in a really good place, and people were not convinced that the thing that Clinton was being impeached for was all that impeachable, right? And so it backfired on Republicans. But mostly, I think, Tim, if you just try to figure between now and November, there are a million twists and turns that can happen. And yet I just keep looking at, as I said, I just look at like 4 or 5 fundamental pieces of information, sort of pillars to help guide me. And, one is the president's job approval rating. The second is enthusiasm, right? And we know the party in power, their voters are usually not as energized to go out and vote as the out party. We're seeing that show up in polling and in actual turnout results in elections that have happened. I look at job approval rating among independent voters because they clearly are the ones that are the fulcrum, right? Which way they go, especially if they break decidedly. And then in terms of the mood, if it is true that inflation is here to stay, at least through the end of the year, now it may not be as high as it is right now. October, hopefully we're not still looking at $5 a gallon gas or whatever it is out in your part of the country, but we'll still be in it. We will still be in a time of incredible disruption for the economy and for something that really hits people every day, right? It's not one of those like theoretical things about, even if it's the stock market isn't doing particularly well, or, the job market is sluggish, or housing starts are sluggish, or it's too hot, too cold. But this, man, every time you go to the grocery store, every time you go out to dinner, every time you fill up your tank, it's just like, right? Hits you.
And that's tough to overcome. What I didn't hear you say is the fundraising thing. I mean, does that matter as much as it used to?
So funny you ask that, because there was a time when I would be obsessed about how much money are the campaign committees raising? Who's got what where? Now the money is coming from so many different places, right? There are people who are raising it online. It feels like if you go through and you look at the number of ads run in, especially a statewide race, look at who has sponsored that ad. Very few of them say the name of the candidate, right? It's not I'm Amy Walter, I approved this message. It's like,
can you quantify that? Or is it like, what's your gut? How does your gut quantify that? Is it like X% candidate?
Some people have. I wish I had that. There are two. The Wesleyan Media Project does a great job of looking at that. But the point being, like, even if you are a Senate candidate, this is especially true in Senate and House races. But maybe you haven't raised a ton of money, right? And again, this used to be a really big problem in the pre-Super PAC days, where you kind of limp into a general election. You don't have a whole lot of money. That gives your opponent plenty of time to, in that period where you, as a guy or woman who made it through a bruising primary, has to go quickly try to raise as much money as possible. Your opponent uses that time to define the race and define you. Now, most of these committees or super PACs, they're ready and ready to go, right? So as soon as the primary is over, we pivot to putting a whole bunch of stuff on air to make sure that our candidate isn't behind the eight ball. I think fundraising becomes critically important, as is it still is cheaper to buy advertising as a candidate than as an outside group. So individual candidate fundraising, again, I think this is especially true at the House level, becomes really important. And I also think it is one of those things that helps us to gauge enthusiasm. If what we're seeing, and I think by the end of the summer, we'll have a really good sense of this, or maybe the June filings. If you start to see candidates, because the enthusiasm right now on the Republican side, so in this case, Republican candidates just raising money hand over fist, right? They're just raising it all online. And that's going to tell you something about just how much more engaged Republican voters are likely to be as well.
There was a really interesting story this past week about a state legislator who's Republican in this case, but could be a Democrat, in a state who's on the more sort of bomb thrower extreme end of their caucus, who had raised $2 million. I mean, this is someone who's not in the caucus leadership, not the Speaker of the House, Senate President, in a state legislative district, who would raise $2 million because they have a national platform as a very loud voice in the side of things. And back to what you said earlier, boy, does that change the dynamics. The party leadership in this case had raised like $500,000. And one of their members with a national platform, because they trend on Twitter, had this tremendous war chest.
Yeah, now imagine how hard it is to govern in that era. I mean, again, coming in the 90s, the leadership in the House especially, look, they kept people in line by saying, you don't do this, you're going to be off this committee, and this committee is the opportunity for you to meet donors and have access to, right, blah, blah, blah. Or I will introduce you to donors. Or I remember being this was before McCain-Feingold, which cut off the soft money access from the parties to be able to just write these checks directly to candidates. I think it was at the DSCC, so the Democratic Senate Committee was upset at a candidate and how they were running their campaign, said something to him like, this isn't your seat to win or lose. It's our seat. This is our seat. We basically have paid for it. You're going to listen to us. Now the candidates are like, I don't need you. I can go find my own money. And I know this guy who knows another guy, and they're putting millions of dollars in a super PAC, and that's going to come. You know this because you're seeing it at the state legislative level too. Just the parties have become weaker and weaker.
If you talk to the speakers of the houses and the Senate presidents and the leaders out there, they will say their biggest challenge. I mean, they won't say it in front of a microphone, but they'll tell you their biggest challenge are they're within their own caucuses. Their problem, these problem children who now have so much more tools at their disposal to sow disruption and to prevent the sort of governing. and sound policy making. I'm fond of saying that legislatures pass over 20,000 pieces of legislation every year on the stuff that matters to people, education and all this. And of course, it gets the lightning rod stuff gets a lot of attention, but it's mostly just trying to solve problems in states. And but it's a lot more difficult to focus on that when you've got rogue elements who are within your own caucus, who are difficult in the room, but also increasingly more powerful outside the room, and just causing you headache after headache after headache. And every time there are 7,000 legislators, 7,383, I think I have to say that every podcast. Every day, two of them get attention nationally because they do something really dumb. And those people have always existed. I mean, the legislators have been doing dumb stuff forever. Of course, the vast majority of them are, solid people and all this, but now it gets blown up, and it's just a different time. Obviously, I will say it's interesting that one thing about this year is that we'll be paying more attention to primaries than I think ever before, and I've seen it at the legislative level. In fact, the Texas primaries were interesting. There was a very big intra-party war at some level. Maybe war is not the right word. Skirmish, big skirmish on the Republican side, and actually, kind of the insurgent wing did not fare all that well.
You're exactly right. It's so important to keep track of those things because the outsized attention that the insurgency gets does not reflect their actual success, right? Now, to your point, it doesn't take that many though, right? If you have, and especially in states where you don't have a super majority. So if you have a majority of 4 or 5 and you got 3 insurgents, well, I
could tell you stories, Amy. I mean, I know you see it at the national level, but I state by state by state, it's really one of maybe the biggest challenge that legislative leaders are dealing with is these extreme voices. And it is, again, both sides. At the end of the day, they have to govern. That's the other challenge, too, is that sometimes you're out recruiting candidates and the best candidate may not be the best legislator, per se. We talked a little bit about the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. How has media changed? Of course, now we're in the lightning round, so you got to do this in 27 seconds or less. But the media landscape, and where are you going to take Cook Political Report? I mean, it's been what it has for over 30 years. So where does it go now?
It's an excellent question. And I think we start with an incredible brand. We have such a benefit there. And some of it is making sure that this brand that, was built up way back in the 80s, but that it stays relevant as we go through each one of these decades. And it has in large part because of just the success and the respect that Charlie had. But we have a really incredible team that also has been able to sort of spread the gospel, if you will, of Charlie. I do think that this is especially as our politics continues to be so polarizing that folks are desperate for a voice that's going to come in and say, look, we're not picking sides in this thing. I'm not telling you what to think. Sometimes I'm going to give you can ask me what I think is going to happen, and you may not like the answer, but my job isn't to make you feel better or worse. I'm not here. Also, if I'm delivering you news that is going to be bad, I'm not there to, as the kids would say, dunk on you about it. If you need and want to understand our politics, the climate, what is happening, again, at the federal level and gubernatorial level in terms of elections and the trends that go along with those, we are your resource.
I can't tell you how many times I saw an article from Charlie and I would read it and think, why is no one saying this? Like, he nailed it. And I just think there's a huge place for that voice of, you don't have to be contrarian per se, but when the herd's going somewhere, there are these hyper credible people, and I think you're kind of in that space that are saying, wait a minute, there's something else going on over here. So you guys are really good at that, and I know you'll continue that tradition. Thank you very much, Amy. Really terrific. Thank you.
It was a lot of fun. We'll talk soon.
My guest was Amy Walter, editor and publisher of Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Thanks for listening to Legislature's The Inside Story. I'm your host, Tim Story with NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures. Go to ncsl.org if you'd like to listen to that episode again, or to tap into the wealth of resources we have for lawmakers and legislative staff on all the major issues in the states and territories.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate NCSL podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Our American States, and the special series, Building Democracy.